Well, I kicked off this series talking about headlines, the headlines that we see in our world, but also more personally, our own personal headlines. You know, those moments of life that just the pain surges, the suffering seems to overwhelm, the loss is everywhere. And how do we make our way through these personal headlines? But the thing that we know, as I quickly skipped over the world headlines or our national headlines, you know, we all know our personal headlines, but we also know we live in a broken and fractured world, don't we? I mean, this week I spent some time as I was making my way through this third part of the series Courageous Endurance, and I opened up my favorite news apps, and I just started to read through all the headlines from what's going on in our world and in our country, and I didn't have to go search for headlines. I mean, these were the first ones that emerged on all of these different, where I get my news from, which is a very varied, different perspectives and different viewpoints. And here's just a few of the headlines from just this last week. No peak in sight as China reports 5,000 new coronavirus patients. Harvard prof sounds alarm on likely pandemic. Disease modelers, maybe 4,400,000 cases. End of the world, coronavirus panic and African locust plague. Have you watched those videos? Crazy. Spark Bible apocalypse fears. Why witchcraft is on the rise. Dozens of people killed in Syrian airstrikes, a human rights group say. And then, just the political headlines from within our own country. I mean, these aren't world headlines. These are just United States of America, right? Like 9 exhausting days of Trump's post-impeachment rage. Trump to headline, $580,600 per couple fundraiser. What do you get for that amount? Oh, better be good food. What every American needs to know about campaign money in 2020, like what you get for $580,000 per couple. Shock poll, Sanders plus 10 in dim race. And Carville fires back at Bernie. At least I'm not a communist. You see, as we make our way through this series, Courageous Endurance, we've been following this honest conversation between a guy named Habakkuk or Habakkuk and God. And you know, here's what we all know. I mean, we have our headlines from today, but Habakkuk had his own world headlines. And what we're going to see today and discover today is, the specifics between our world headlines today and Habakkuk's world headlines. The specifics are different, but when we start to line them up, they all look pretty similar. They're almost the same. And this conversation between Habakkuk and God was some 2,600 years ago. And when we first kind of take a step into this conversation, we quickly realize what was going on between Habakkuk and God. You see, there was this pattern, a pattern that, we should all embrace. And the pattern between Habakkuk and God was there's this wandering, waiting, and wrestling going on. Where Habakkuk was going to God saying, hey, God, the moral depravity of Judah. Judah was the nation that Habakkuk was part of, that he was living in. Judah, the 2 southern tribes, the 2 remaining tribes of Israel, of God's chosen people. And Habakkuk was saying to God, hey, God, do you see the moral depravity of Judah, your nation, your people? What say you, God? What say you, God? And Habakkuk did a whole bunch of waiting. Just, come on, God, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to say about it? And you could tell the angst and the anxiety and the fear within Habakkuk saying, hey, God, I'm trying to follow you, but everyone else around me isn't. The headlines. God finally responds, and God says, hey, I'm going to send in the Babylonians. And this just blew Habakkuk's mind because, well, Judah was completely morally depraved, but compared to the Babylonians, the evil, vile Babylonians, if you put them side by side, well, Judah started to look more like Girl Scouts selling Girl Scout cookies. Oh, Thin Mints. Thin Mints in a freezer? Oh. And by the way, you don't read serving size on Girl Scout cookie box. Thin Mints, it's one entire sleeve. That's one serving. Oh. And it just blows Habakkuk's mind saying, God, I mean, Judah's morally depraved, but why are you using the Babylonians? And all of this leads to this, well, our third part of our series, to this section in this conversation between Habakkuk and God called the woes. Now, this word woe is not a word we commonly use in our day and age some 2,600 years later. But this word woe has everything to do in the ancient Hebrew language with this feeling of lament or sorrow, but attached to it is judgment that will happen. Not judgment that might happen, but judgment that will 100% happen. And so there's going to be 5 woes that will kind of paint this picture of a headline of what's going on, what is happening, and the judgment that's going to get attached to it. Now, what we need to understand is some 2,600 years later, the specifics are different, but our headlines are remarkably the same. So as we make our way through these 5 woes, what I've tried to do is take what is happening and what's being described some 2,600 years ago and attach a question that just shoves it into our culture. And then attached to every woe of what's happening, there's judgment. And what I've tried to do is take that judgment that was articulated some 2,600 years ago and just bring it into our kind of modern day language. And so that will all make sense as we go through it, but just trying to take what was said and apply it to now. Now, before we get into these woes, I have 2 very important cautions. Very important cautions. Now, the first caution is this. As we make our way through these woes, remember, these woes are all attached to government. We could even use the word politics. And here's what I know. Across all of our campuses, everyone watching online, the vast majority of people fall in one of 2 categories, red or blue, Democrat or Republican. Now, I know there's a few of you that are, aligned in a couple other, parties, but just for the sake of this caution, let's just pretend everyone is attached here. And for some of you, you're kind of on one side of the line or kind of on the other side of the line. For some of you, you're way on one side or way on the other side. And I'm going to make some statements. Okay, this is a caution. I'm going to make some statements. And you're going to want to shove me one way or the other. I'm going to make some statements and you're going to go, I knew it. I knew Chris was. I knew Chris was. I knew what Chris was. I'm going to make some statements and you're going to want to extrapolate a whole lot of other thoughts attached because you are on one side or the other. I'm just telling you, you won't know which side I'm on. I believe 110% as Christ followers, we should vote and we should be active in our country. But I also believe 100% of me that beyond politics, as Christ followers, we're called to be unified as a church. That the unity of the church, which the church's people, is more important than political viewpoints. That's why I'll never leverage the stage for politics. And that's why today my challenge for all of you is this. Don't think Republican, Democrat, blue, red. For the next 20-some minutes, please think purple. Doesn't that feel better? Just right? Just better, right? You're just like, oh, for 20-some minutes, I know some of you have a twitch right now. Some of you are like, for some of you, you're like, oh, you have no idea what I'm going to say next, right? I'm just saying, this is what I'm going to ask you to do, right? As soon as you want to go back to your side or attach me to a side, I just want you to go, yeah, Chris said think purple. In 20-some minutes, you can go back to red, you can go back to blue, you can go back. For the sake of our time together, because this is going to help you. It's going to help you. Second thing, or the second caution I want to challenge you on. Because we'll spend a lot of time looking at government and politics and big corporations and all of those kind of entities in our country, because this is part of the woes. But if we miss the second one, I just think it's going to be tragic. Because attached to every woe, again, there's going to be a clarifying question and there's a judgment. There's going to be a kind of an action reality attached to it. And my challenge for you is, yeah, we'll talk about governments and corporations, all that stuff. But there's going to be a woe that's going to hit a nerve within you. And I just want you, with joy, even though that nerve, right, that tension is going to get your attention, I just want to encourage you, just embrace it, right? Just like, oh, like that doesn't feel good, but I'm still going to smile, right? Because here's the thing, when God gets our attention, and God usually uses tension to get our attention. When God gets our attention, guess what we can do? We're going to say, okay, God, what do I need to change? What do I need to focus on? What is it within me? I'm just going to tell you, there's going to be a woe. It's like, ugh. And that's why thinking purple is important, because when that tension hits, you're going to want to push me to a red side or a blue side. You're going to try to attach some political viewpoint that I'm using the stage to push the church to I'm not. Hear me. When that tension hits, go, okay, God, you got my attention. I got to pay attention to that. Don't miss that. Don't miss that. So before we get into these 5 woes, there's a really quick kind of lead up. And I'm going to have to kind of break this down because there's all these pronouns within these woes that can make it feel confusing of what is the text really saying. So this is the quick lead up. Well, not all of them taunt him with ridicule and scorn, saying, and the saying is the 5 woes. Now, them means all the countries that Babylon has conquered. All the countries of Babylon, this mighty, mighty empire has come in and completely devastated. So all these countries that have felt the wrath and the rage of Babylon are the them. So will not all of them taunt him, and him is Babylon. Will they not all taunt Babylon with ridicule and scorn? Okay? And this sets up the woes. Woe number 1. Woe to him who piles up stolen goods and makes himself wealthy by extortion. Now, what would happen is Babylon would come into a nation like Judah. They would come in, they'd conquer the people, they would take all the government resources that had been collected, they'd find all the wealthy people, take all of their collection of items and goods, they would take everything worth of value for themselves. This is not just Babylon. Babylon were just experts at it, but this has happened over the course of history. Countries would come in, they would conquer other countries, they would take all of the wealth for themselves. Which leads to this question, the question that we have to ask ourselves. Are the powerful disempowering the less powerful? That's the essence of this woe. We can attach this question to people in our political government, whether it's president, whether it's the House, the state, whatever form of government. Are the people in positions of power disempowering people who are less powerful? You can attach this to big companies, medium-sized companies, small companies. You could even change the word power to influence. Are people in positions of influence marginalizing people with less influence? And where we could stare at government, where we could stare at politicians, where we could stare at CEOs and big companies, let's just personalize this for a moment. As a man, in your position of power or influence, Are you disempowering people around you? As a husband, are you disempowering? As a father, are you disempowering? Women, in your position as a woman, are you disempowering or leveraging your influence to marginalize? As a coach, how are you leveraging your power, your influence? As a teacher, how are you leveraging your power, your influence? As a shift supervisor, how are you leveraging your power, your influence? See, all of this, we can stare at all of the big power conglomerates above us, but in all reality, we should ask ourselves these questions. How are we leveraging our power, our influence to the people connected to us? Well, like I mentioned, every woe states what was happening, and then there's a judgment attached to that woe, because woe is lament, sorrow for what is happening, and a judgment that will come. And so this is a judgment attached to it. Will not your creditors suddenly arise? Will they not wake up and make you tremble? Then you will become their prey. Because you have plundered many nations, the people who are left will plunder you. Do you hear what's going on, Babylon? Babylon, everyone you have plundered one day will come back and plunder you. For you have shed human blood. You have destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. And what I just simply wrote, right, the judgment was this. What goes around comes around. And isn't that just true to this day? How you treat people will always come back to you, the good or the bad. How you leverage your influence will come back around to you. How you leverage your power will come back to you. What goes around comes around. And that's just true. True 2,600 years ago and true to this day. Now, the second woe is very similar to this first woe. The second woe is this. Woe to him who builds his house by unjust gain, setting his nest on high to escape the clutches of ruin. Now remember again, Babylon would come into nations like Judah. And all of that wealth that they would collect for themselves, right? They would use for themselves. They would keep it. They use the wealth of other countries, other nationalities, other people to make them more wealthy. That was the unjust gain. So the question we have to ask ourselves is this: is power being leveraged or is influence being leveraged for selfish gain? Now, gain's not the issue, right? Having nice things is not the issue. Wearing nice clothing, having a nice truck, living in a nice house, going on a nice vacation, right? That's not the issue. The issue is unjust or selfish gain, where we use our position of power, of influence, and we keep our eyes focused on ourselves, saying, well, I don't care about your needs, I care about my needs. I don't care how this decision impacts you as long as it makes my life better. The judgment attached to this woe is this: you have plotted the ruin of many people, shaming your own house and forfeiting your life. What it's saying is, Babylon, you've plotted the taking over of nation after nation after nation, and guess what? In doing so, you're going to die. You're going to forfeit your life. That's the judgment that's coming to Babylon. The stones of the wall will cry out, and the beams of the woodwork will echo it. And the judgment simply is this: you'll reap what they sow. You will reap what you sow. I grew up, my dad would say that line over and over again: son, you'll reap what you sow. Always in that dad voice. Son, you'll reap what you sow. Son, you'll reap what you sow. Son, you'll reap what you sow. And one day, I think I was a teenager, one day I realized that phrase actually it comes from the Bible. And I went to my dad. I'm like, Dad, because I thought that was his saying. I'm like, Dad, that's not your saying. That comes from the Bible. And he looked at me with that no duh, are you really that dumb, son look? He's like, yeah, I know. It comes from Galatians. I'm like, oh, you knew that. You're right. Then I felt like an idiot. He's like, yeah. He goes, it's in the Proverbs, right? You'll reap what you sow. And here's the thing, we all get this. That's why these two first woes are so similar. You know, what goes around comes around, and you will reap what you sow. One of the things I say to my girls all the time, every action has a consequence. The question is it going to be a good consequence or a bad consequence? But that's determined by the action. I say it all the time. Your actions has a consequence. And the consequence will determine whether the action is good or bad. It's up to you. Do you want to live a life with good consequences? If so, choose good actions. If you want to live a life with bad consequences, guess what? Then you'll choose bad actions. But the consequences always reveal the action. You will reap what you sow. What you plant will always grow. How you treat people, how you leverage your power and your influence. How you see people. Do you see them as objects, as pawns in your life? Or do you see them as a value of God's created beings? That every single person has value. Which goes into woe number 3. Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and establishes a town by injustice. What this woe is pointing out is Babylon, as they would go in to conquer nations, they would capture the people, the strong, the craftsmen, the people with skill sets, and they would take them as slave labor to build their nation, to build their city. For Babylon, other people were all pawns. They were all objects to accomplish building their nation. So the question we have to ask, are people being used and abused? Are people being used and abused? When you think about our world, child abuse, sexual abuse. You think about what's going on within our local communities with foster care and CYS, kids' entire lives that are just broken and in shambles. You think about what is going on in our country with immigration. Think purple, please. I'm not talking about a wall. I'm talking about real life people, human beings. I'm talking about what's going on across our planet. Entire groups of people that are living in war zones, that are fleeing for their lives, that are just trying to survive. And we get caught up in the politics of immigration where God sees individual human beings. And I'm not saying there's easy solution to all of it, but maybe we spend less time talking about our political viewpoints and realize there are people dying and that we should care about them. That stop posting someone's political viewpoint and maybe say, what can I do to help save a life? Because in God's economy, it's not about borders or walls. It's about individual human beings that have absolute value to God. We can't change the world, but we can impact a life. That's what we can do. And every woe has a judgment. And this is a judgment. Has not the Lord Almighty, or the literal translated, the Lord's army, determined that the people's labor is only fuel for the fire, that the nations exhaust themselves for nothing, meaning Babylon is building their world and it's going to all disappear. And guess what we know about history? Babylon's disappeared. Every country, right, has risen and fallen, risen and fallen. We just know, that is a story of history. And then this is such an amazing judgment. For the earth will be filled with a knowledge, not information. That's not what this word means. It's not about the knowledge of God. No. This word, this ancient Hebrew word, has everything to do with relationship with. To know God, not information about God, but to know God as in a relationship with God. Be filled with the relationship with God, of the glory, which means the presence. The presence of God as the waters cover the sea. See, the judgment is that God's presence will cover this earth. And that's why we landed on this thought last week. And this is the story arc of the Bible, which is this judgment. God's pursuit is for all people to pursue him. It's God's pursuit. He desires to have a relationship with all people. It's why Jesus came, to be the conduit, to be the bridge to the almighty, holy, righteous God the Father. And that's why we as a church, this is just what we're about. It's why we're okay with canceling a weekend service to do a Love First weekend, like we did right before Christmas, and just said, go serve people. Here's some ideas, but just go find ways just to go put love into action. It's why we partnered this last Christmas with CYS, with our Christmas wish. Why? Because we just want to get presents in the hands of kids in foster care and families. They're stepping in to help the lives of kids that are abused, kids that their home framework is in shambles, willing just to love them in the mess. It's why we as a church encourage all of you, get plugged into a life group, because life groups start to serve each other, then they start to serve their neighborhoods, they start to serve their relational framework, and they start to put love into action. That's why life groups are so powerful, about doing life together to serve each other. It's why this phrase, that we want to be a church that loves people by serving people to Jesus. Because this is what Jesus has put in motion. Love everyone. How do you do that? Serve them. Love everyone. Serve them. And as you serve them, point them back to me. It's why we want to launch more churches, not because we want more churches. We want more churches filled with people that understand that as Christ followers, their call is to love people by serving people to Jesus. And when that happens within local communities, we start to change the local community from the inside out. It is the purpose of the church. God's pursuit is for all people to pursue him. That the knowledge, the glory of the Lord will be like the waters covering the seas. The fourth woe. Woe to him who gives drink to his neighbors, pouring it from the wineskin until they are drunk, so that he can gaze on their naked bodies. Now, if I would break this apart in the ancient Hebrew language, it'd go from PG to rated R. So I'm not going to do that. But what this woe is really getting at is, this question right here: are people being intentionally lured into sin? Is this happening? Is this happening on the government level? Is this happening on the big company level? Is this happening personally? I watched a documentary this last week or two on Netflix called The Pharmacist. If you've not watched this documentary called The Pharmacist, you need to. It's about a pharmacist, creative name. And this guy, this pharmacist, lost his son in a drug deal, a drug transaction gone bad. And that was his valley moment. But remember, this is the storyline of this series, right? What God can do in some of the lowest moments. And so as he was trying to help the cops find the person who shot his son on a drug deal gone bad, he started to realize there was a pattern. And I'm talking, this is years and years and years ago, way before had hit our headlines. But the pattern that this pharmacist started to notice was all of these people were coming in with large prescriptions for opioids. And he started to realize that there was one doctor in his area writing all of these prescriptions for opioids. And the more he dug into it, he realized that there was this crisis of addiction happening that no one was talking about. And the more he researched it, the more he realized it was spreading across this country. And again, before it hit the headlines, before everyone was talking about it. And then he traced it to this one company, big company that was making billions of dollars, saying, oh, these drugs aren't addictive, these drugs aren't addictive, as they were lining their pockets. And right towards the end of this documentary, it talked about that as now the government has locked down on prescription medications, now what the issue is heroin and meth. And guess what we know across all of our local communities? The devastation of drug addiction in our communities. We all know someone, at least one person, right, addicted to pain medication, heroin, meth, you name it. But you got to also personalize it. Is your sin luring people in? Because you don't want to deal with your sin, so you don't want to feel guilty. So you want people to join you in your sin. Because if you can get people to join you in your sin, now you don't feel as bad because they're with you. And maybe it's okay. The judgment. You'll be filled with shame instead of glory. Now it's your turn. Drink and let your nakedness be exposed. The cup from the Lord's right hand is coming around to you, and disgrace will cover your glory. Simply said, this is a judgment. That God is the righteous judge. It's like, hey, Habakkuk. God sees what's going on. Hey, Habakkuk. God knows about Judah. God knows about Babylon. God sees it all. And he is the righteous judge. And it's why God sent Jesus as a sacrifice on the cross. For Jesus' blood to cover our sin. But God is still righteous, and he still is judge. And he will judge. Which leads to the fifth rule. Of what value is an idol carved by a craftsman or an image that teaches lies? Remember the Babylonian culture. I mean, they worshiped many, many, many gods, and they would craft little idols out of stone and wood, whatever material, right, to worship these idols. For the one who makes it trusts his own creation. He makes idols that cannot speak. Woe to him who says to wood, come to life, or the lifeless stone, wake up. Can it give guidance? It is covered with gold and silver. There's no breath in it. And the question is this: who or what is your God? Who or what is your God? Which leads to the second question that you got to ask yourself. Who are you going to trust? Because if you're not going to place all your trust, it's not like you can go, God, I'm going to give you 50% of trust. The other 50% I'm just going to carve off and place it over here. It's all in or nothing. If you're not all in trusting God, something or someone else is going to become your God. Who are you going to trust? Or what are you going to trust? Which leads to this judgment. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. Let all the earth come into his presence. Let all the earth stand and stare at his glory. You see the judgment. And there's so much hope. The judgment. It's that God is on his throne. God, sovereign God, holy God, righteous judge God, that God's on his throne and everything is underneath his power. The things we understand and things we don't understand, the things that don't make sense in our limited scope, that God sees it all, knows it all, is over it all, even when our headlines, both in our world, in our nation, and in our lives, seem so out of control, that God is on his throne. And that should make it all the more easier to say, God, okay, I will trust you. You see, through the series, we've been talking about this spiritual journey that we're all on. And that is in these valley moments where you have to not just wait and wonder the why God wonderings, but you got to wrestle with God. It's in the wrestling. It's why Habakkuk's name, that means embrace or wrestle, is so important. For some of you, you've just never wrestled with God, and you need to wrestle with God. Keep coming back to him, having those honest conversations, those toe-to-toe, spit splattering, veins bulging, word spewing, silence deafening, no holds barred conversations with God. Just keep coming to God. Wrestle with him, because if you don't wrestle with him, you will wander away from him. But maybe you notice there's this one last question mark. And this one last question mark is the catalyst for you to start climbing out of that valley. And it's one more W's. W's are everywhere, by the way. And this one last W is where Habakkuk lands. It's where we're going to end this series in part 4. Now, the question that we've asked throughout the whole series is this question: how do you respond when what you see with your eyes doesn't align with what you know in your heart? How do you respond with what you see when the headlines of suffering and pain in your life are so overwhelming? When what you see about the abuse that's happening within kids' lives, sexual abuse, rape, the treatment of people around our world. What do you do with when you see with your own eyes doesn't align with what you know in your heart about God? The answer is where Habakkuk came to, is you got to just trust God, that he's on his throne, that nothing is happening without him allowing it to happen. Even in moments where we can't comprehend why God would allow that to happen. And that's why wrestling is so important. It's where Habakkuk came to. God, I don't understand. I don't understand Babylon. I don't understand Babylon. I don't understand Babylon. I don't understand why you're allowing that to happen. And in the wrestling, Habakkuk comes to this place and say, okay, God, I trust you because you are on your throne. Here in a moment, across all of our campuses, there's going to be a song that's going to be sung. And I just want to encourage all of you, just stay seated in this moment. And as you listen to these words, maybe, just maybe, you just take your hands, you open them up, and you place them in your lap, and you just say, okay, God, I'm keeping my hands open. There's times in my life I would just close my fists, but God, I'm just going to keep them open. I'm just going to trust you. You see, some of the words that are going to be sung are this: I don't know how the story ends. And I think that creates so much angst, right? When we see the suffering, we see the pain in our life, in our world, and we just don't know the end of the story. I don't know how the story ends, but I know that you finished it. I'll close my eyes and just let go and fall into my only hope. There's safety in the falling when I surrender fully. I put all my hope in you. In Jesus, I will trust you. In Jesus, I will trust you.